completely different part of the world that you've not probably ever seen. This is Harrow Boys School, one of the two most exclusive schools in Britain, along with Eton. This is where all the rich, the diplomats' kids, the business kids come to. This is the refectory, which means the dining room behind me. If you pan over here, you will see the church. This is their chapel. Coming on over here, maybe some of you may even recognize the buildings because these were part of Harry Potter films. This is goes back to, I think, the 13th century. And you see two Muslim girls behind me. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about Islam. Because even in a school like this, Islam is coming all over to this country. You know that we've been going through this whole series on whether or not the Quran is adaptable or reasonable or relevant for the 20th century. I want to just look at this woman here. You can see she's wearing a hijab there, and she is a student here in London, but she's wearing a hijab. So it's about that hijab that I want to talk about specifically, because I've always asked my Muslim friends, I said, why is it that women have to wear the hijab? Why is it they're wearing either the hijab or the niqab or the jilbab or the purda or the chador, especially the purda and the chador, which is a complete covering. And they've always said it was because of the Quran. So I wanted to go back to the Quran, and I want to show you where in the Quran it talks about it. And it's fascinating. You have to go to chapter 33, verse 59. Now I'm going to be using Hilali and Khan's translation, where it says in verse 59, O Prophet, tell your wives and your daughters and the women of the believers, so that's not just the Prophet's wives, it's everybody, all the believers, the women of the believers, to draw their cloaks, their veils, all over their bodies. Now in parentheses, this is not part of the Arabic, but according to Hilali and Khan, that means screen themselves completely except the eyes or one eye to see the way. Then it continues back with the Arabic, that will be better, that they should be known, so as not to be annoyed. And Allah is ever oft forgiving, most merciful. So here the Quran is very clear that the women, not just the Prophet's wives, like some Muslims have told me, all women who are believers are to cover their entire bodies, according to Hilali and Khan, only leaving their eyes free. And I've always asked the reason, why? Why would God demand this of women? And they would say, so they will not be annoyed. In other words, so they will not be seducing other men and therefore be annoyed by that. And so the idea is that they're covering themselves to keep this stare, the men, from bothering them. So the obvious problem is, or the obvious question I would ask is, who's got the problem here? Do the women have the problem, or do the men have the problem? And obviously the answer is, the men have the problem. So the women have to cover themselves up because the men have the problem. Now when I look at the Quran, I look at chapter 6 verse 164, and I look at chapter 53 verse 38, and it's very clear that no one can take on the guilt of another in both those verses, which means nobody should be taking on the guilt of another person, or no one should be taking on the responsibility of the problem that the men have in this case. Am I correct on that? And is this not a theological contradiction? If in chapter 6 and also chapter 53 it's very clear that you cannot be taking on the guilt of another, then chapter 33 verse 59 seemed to suggest to me that here the women are taking on the guilt of the men. They've got the problem, the women have to pay the price. Is that relevant for today? Absolutely not. In the Bible it's very clear that if a man sins, he's to pluck out his own eye, not the woman's eye. You pluck out your own eye. And the Bible is very clear, Jesus is very clear, that the man must pay responsibility for his own sin. Now, we don't obviously cut off our eye, pluck out our eye. That means it's as bad. In other words, get rid of it. You are the ones that are responsible for your own sins, therefore you pay the price. Fascinating that here in the Quran, it's very much the women paying responsibility. Is that relevant? Again, let's get back to that question, since that's what we're asking. No, it's not relevant, because it's the face that gives the identity to the women. It's the face that tells you which women are different from the others. And if you don't have that, then you all see you can't tell one from the other. And that's why it's so important that we do have the face uncovered. And that's why, in some ways, when you look at the Quran and when you see what it's done with women, we've been talking about women here, it is absolutely irrelevant for today, for any day, for the women, for anyone. That's why I say, come on back to the Bible. The Bible gets it correct. God bless you. Isn't it great being here in Harrow? You can see the refectory here. Just looking at this beautiful, beautiful buildings. Old, I mean, it's like we've stepped back a century or two. This is the kind of thing that I love to bring people to whenever they come. This is where we lived for many years. Not right here. I would have loved to live up here, but in this area of the world. And it's almost as if the old England has still been retained. And I want to see that old England retained as well, because there's something about the old England that remembers the Judeo-Christian heritage that I also want to see. We'll be talking more about that as we go on. Great. This is Jay here in Harrow, in England. Over and out.